How have the perspectives on the Cold War of Russian historians differed from those in the West? The historiography of the Cold War has undergone significant shifts since the late 1980s, with Russian and formerly Soviet interpretations diverging markedly from dominant Western perspectives. While Western scholarship has moved through orthodox, revisionist, and post-revisionist phases, Russian historical writing has been shaped by ideological constraints under the Soviet system, followed by a partial liberalization after 1991 and a return to state-influenced narratives under Putin. This essay argues that Russian perspectives have consistently differed from Western ones in their emphasis on Soviet defensive motivations, portrayal of the United States as the primary aggressor, and reluctance to accept moral equivalence or Soviet responsibility for key escalations. These differences stem from both ideological legacies and contemporary political imperatives, though post-1991 access to archives briefly narrowed the gap before a new divergence emerged. During the Soviet period, 1945–1991, official historiography presented a monolithic view that was fundamentally at odds with Western interpretations. Soviet historians, working under strict party control, depicted the Cold War as an inevitable consequence of capitalist hostility towards socialism. The United States and its allies were portrayed as aggressive imperialists seeking to destroy the Soviet Union and prevent the spread of communism. Key events such as the Truman Doctrine, 1947, the Marshall Plan, 1948, and the formation of NATO, 1949, were interpreted as deliberate attempts to encircle and isolate the USSR. The Berlin Blockade, 1948–1949, was justified as a defensive response to Western plans to create a separate West German state, while the Korean War, 1950–1953, was framed as an American-led aggression against the Korean people. Soviet actions, including the establishment of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, were presented as legitimate responses to security needs and popular revolutions. This perspective was codified in textbooks and works such as those by V.P. Potemkin and the Institute of World History of the USSR Academy of Sciences, which emphasized the USSR's role as a defender of peace and progress against imperialist aggression. In contrast, Western historiography during the same period was dominated first by the Orthodox school, 1940s–1960, and then by revisionism, 1960s–1980s. Orthodox historians such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and Herbert Fayes placed primary responsibility on Stalin's expansionism and ideological aggression. The revisionist school, led by scholars such as William Appleman Williams and Gabriel Kalko, shifted blame towards American economic imperialism and the desire to maintain global capitalist hegemony. While revisionists criticized U.S. actions more than Orthodox writers, they still operated within a framework that assumed Western democratic values and Soviet totalitarianism, a moral dichotomy largely absent from Soviet accounts. The post-revisionist synthesis of the 1980s, John Lewis Gaddis, Melvin Leffler, sought a balanced view, acknowledging misperceptions and security dilemmas on both sides, but continued to hold the Soviet Union primarily responsible for initiating and sustaining the conflict. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the opening of archives in the early 1990s briefly created a convergence between Russian and Western perspectives. Historians such as Vladislav Zubak, Konstantin Pleshakov, and Alexander Fursenko, working with newly available Politburo and Foreign Ministry documents, produced nuanced accounts that acknowledged Stalin's miscalculations, paranoia, and responsibility for many escalations. Zubak and Pleshakov's Inside the Kremlin's Cold War, 1996, portrayed Stalin as both ideologically driven and pragmatically cautious, while recognizing that Soviet actions in Eastern Europe were not purely defensive. This period saw Russian scholarship align more closely with post-revisionist Western interpretations that emphasized mutual misperceptions and structural factors rather than unilateral aggression. However, since the mid-2000s, and especially under Vladimir Putin, Russian historiography has diverged sharply once again. State-sponsored narratives, reflected in textbooks approved by the Ministry of Education and works by historians such as Nikolai Starikov and Sergei Narishkin, director of the Russian Historical Society, have revived elements of the Soviet-era perspective. The United States is again portrayed as the primary aggressor, with NATO expansion, color revolutions, and Western interference in Ukraine, 2014, framed as continuations of Cold War hostility. The Soviet role in Eastern Europe is increasingly justified as necessary for security, while Western accounts are dismissed as Russophobic propaganda. The Cold War is often presented as a defensive struggle against Western encirclement, with Stalin and Brezhnev rehabilitated as strong leaders who protected Russian interests. This shift reflects contemporary political needs, legitimizing great power status, justifying current foreign policy, and countering Western narratives of Russian aggression. In conclusion, Russian perspectives on the Cold War have differed from Western ones in fundamental ways. Soviet-era accounts were ideologically driven and placed sole blame on the West, while early post-Soviet scholarship briefly converged with Western post-revisionism. Since the 2000s, however, Russian historiography has reverted to a defensive, nationalist interpretation that emphasizes Western aggression and Soviet victimhood. These differences are not merely academic, but reflect the interplay between historical evidence, ideological commitment, and contemporary political imperatives. While Western scholarship has increasingly accepted a more nuanced view of mutual responsibility, Russian official narratives have moved in the opposite direction, illustrating the extent to which history remains a political instrument.